Welcome back to another reading and correcting of Bottom Rung with me, Kendar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, the Tiger Supervisor. If you want to read, if you want to listen to these happen live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. And today we are doing Chapter 5. A short tunnel led to another room, and all Tibs saw from the entrance were boulders with narrow path between them. The smallest boulder Tibs saw went up to his chest, most taller than he was, and in the center of the room a stone column reached the ceiling. "Do you think there are traps?" the fighter asked as she peered over the taller boulders. "There's barely any floor to see," Tibbs replied, crouching and studying the scratched patch of the floor he could see between the boulders at the room's entrance. There was enough room to squeeze by each boulder, but it would be a tight fit for their fighters, and Tibbs wasn't sure their other fighter would have fit between them if he hadn't gotten himself killed. "I hear movement," the archer whispered. Tibbs listened, and in the silence of all the others holding their breath, he made out a scratching, but couldn't tell where in the room it came from. The sounds seemed to bounce off the boulders. "Do you know what they are?" he asked in a low voice. "Do I look like I've hunted cave creatures before?" she replied, her voice dropping as she realized she'd raised it. "You said you'd hunted on the king's land," the fighter said before Tibbs could apologize. "The king has mountains, so Tibbs' question makes sense." Tibbs didn't point out he didn't know the king had mountain or even lands. Although it made sense, he just never thought about it. Or royalty was too far beyond him to ever think about. "What do you what king do you have that has mountains?" the archer whispered harshly. The kingdom's all forest." "Clearly we don't come from the same kingdom," the sorceress said before the fighter replied, "and whatever those are, they might not be any animals we've ever seen. Dungeons can make monsters." The fighter stared at her. "You have gotta be She closed her mouth and eyed Tibbs as she took a breath. She avoided swearing because of him. "I know you're not a fighter, Tibbs, but you and me are the only ones who can do close combat." She indicated the knife before looking at the other two. "We're going to need you to give us some cover as we move." I don't know if I'll be able to," the archer said, looking into the room. "All those boulders break my line of sight as soon as there's a few, as soon as you're a few of them deep. I'll shoot anything I'll have to shoot anything, I'll have to step into the room, and that puts me at risk. Both of us, unless you think you can do your magic around them." Surah shook her head. "We need to get through," the fighter said, then considered something. "Unless we want to turn around now and leave without having anything to show for it?" the sorceress asked. "They going to let us even leave without some proof we tried?" "We already lost a fighter," said. "The other team had returned members short and injured. Maybe they'd need injuries for it to count." They suspected this was where they'd gotten that. "Then we need to try to cross the room," the fighter said. "Tibbs, stay with me." He stepped in and squeezing between the boulders, and skittering sounded through the room. The sound was more than the scratching of stone on stone than anything was more the scratching of stone on stone than anything resembling small claws on stone. Tibbs gripped the knife in his hand and looked at the floor for any sign of what was moving around them. The fighter stopped, and when Tibbs looked up to see the column, something small jumped at him. With a scream, Tibbs dropped to his knees, hand over his head. The fighter yelled, and then something fell next to Tibbs. He opened his eyes and looked at two pieces of a stone rat dissolving in and looked as two pieces of a stone rat dissolved into the floor, leaving behind a copper piece. A whole copper piece. Tibbs picked it up gingerly and turned it in his fingers. In his entire life, he'd only heard of whole pieces. There were so few of them on the street, most living there had only ever handled quarters at most, Maybe if you're lucky at all the halves. Thing that's mine. That's more mine than yours, the fighter said, glancing at him before looking around, sword held at the ready. It was still skittering around them. Sorry, he handed her the coin. I was surprised. You're not going to survive by hiding from the creatures in here. She took the coin without even glancing at it, then took his hand and pulled him to his feet. They gave you a knife. You need to use it. He looked at the floor for it and picked it. I don't know how. They didn't teach you? She asked in disbelief. We went over traps and locks. She cursed under her breath and blushed as she glanced at him. The pointed end goes into the creature, as often as you can manage it. A scream made them turn. The sorceress was batting away at something, jumping and crawling over her. Tibs ran to help, having an easier time moving between the boulders. Something jumped at him from the top of a boulder, and Tibs ducked. By the time Tibs reached the entrance, the sorceress had fallen between boulders, out of sight. When he stopped, something bit his ankle, and he slashed at it without thinking. He cut a stone rat into two. He cut a stone rat in two. Something jumped on his shoulder and bit. Getting back a scream, Tibs grabbed the stone rat and smashed it on the floor, crushing it under a foot as he felt claws and teeth bite into his leg and arms. He screamed in fear and pain and anger as he planted the knife into them. They dissolved and left copper piece behind. Once the rats stopped attacking him, he checked on the sorceress. She didn't move, a pool of blood forming around her head from the ripped throat. He swallowed the bile, reminding himself it wasn't the first time he'd seen someone die, although it was the first time he'd been this close as they died. He turned to the sound of more scratching and realized that it was the scuffing of clothes against stone as he watched the archer pull the fighter's body between two of the boulders. She looked pale but determined, as their eye met. Grab any coins you find and pull her away from the entrance, she said. Tibbs looked on the floor. Each of the dead rat had been replaced by a copper coin. He picked up the coin, noting some had different designs on them, and pocketed them. When he grabbed the sorceress's arm and pulled, then he grabbed the sorceress's arm and pulled. Her legs were between boulders and caught on sharp jutting stone. A rat appeared on top of the boulder and jumped at him. Tip screamed and let go of the sorceress as he fell to his knees for protection. Something fell on his head, then plinked on the floor. He opened his eyes, and a copper coin spun before settling. He looked at the archer, who had another arrow notched, as he felt himself for any new injuries. She shot at him. He looked at the coin. She shot the rat in mid-jump and hit it. Hadn't her bow been on her back as she pulled the fighter's body? You look like you needed help, she answered, his slack-jawed look at her. Grab the coin and get back to pulling her away. I'll keep an eye out for more of those rats. He looked at the sorceress. Her legs were still between boulders. I could use some help. Pocketed the coin, then grabbed her arm. Sorry, I don't know how far I can get before her body dissolves. I'd like to be able to keep some of what we made here. Nodded. They said they'd had to bring the dead's equipment back. So it would be the sorcerer's robe, the fighter's shirt, and her sword. Did they use half coins here? The way the fighter hadn't even glanced at her coin made him think she'd been used to handling them. Finally, he had her legs out of the room. He leaned against the wall, panting. He slid down, eyeing the entrance for more rats, but he didn't think he'd have the strength to fight them. The archer pulled the fighter's body next to the sorceress and sat by Tibs. Do you think they're going to let us leave? Tibs asked, pulling his knees to himself and wrapping his arms around them. He never thought he'd want to go back to the street after escaping it. But right now, that seemed like the safer place. We didn't reach the last room. They asked. I'm telling them we did. She answered defiantly. I don't care how badly they want us dead. I'm not giving them the satisfaction. Why? But the tears. I didn't hurt anyone. Just picked a few pockets. Took food from houses. It's not like they ever missed it. She placed an arm around his shoulders, pulled him to her. And I just killed a few rabbits to feed my brother and sisters. They don't care. We're street. As far as they're concerned, we're just good for as dungeon food. Tibbs sniffled. I want to go home. You have a home to go back to? Tibbs shrugs. Right now, we'd take anywhere that wasn't here. Look, she said after a stretching silence, I know you're scared, but we can do this. You showed us how to get through the first room. By the time it's our turn again, we'll have learned more. And we'll make it through this room. We're going to show them that just because we're straight, it doesn't mean we're less than them. What do you say? Tibbs wiped his eyes and forced a smile. Her words reminded him of Mama. I didn't wanted him to give up either. Good. Now, you take her robe and amulet. I'll deal with the fighter's equipment. What amulet? Tibbs asked as he pulled on the robe. Around her neck, the archer said. She put it under her robe. I know where they go. Tibbs replied. Why does she have one? Didn't they take away anything they had? The guards had taken the few quarter coins he'd had before throwing him in the cell. They'd laughed, said they'd earned tinkered each with them. It's a magic thing, I guess. She had the shirt off fighter, or maybe it's an adventurer thing. Back home, I heard about an adventurer who could use an element. Thought they were just stories, Tip said, and immediately recalled the adventurer who had caught the beggar's hand and coated it in ice before breaking it off. He shuddered. Maybe, but the bard who told the story isn't known for making them up. Put the shirt over her shoulder and grabbed the sword. Tibbs had to fold the robe so it wouldn't be too cumbersome on his shoulder. The amulet was a simple disc of brass with a clear crystal in it. Carefully tested the tiles before they crossed the first room again, and the triggers didn't move. Maybe the dungeon had taken pity on them, or maybe it wasn't as cunning as the sorceress had said. Exiting through the crack in the face of the mountain was tougher while carrying the fallen's equipment. In the end, he had to put what he carried down and have her pass it to him once he was outside. When they reached the bottom of the hill, the adventurers on each side of the path watched them. I see not everyone's back, the woman said. What took that fighter of yours? The adventurer said. One would wish their overconfident fighter good luck. The traps or the rats? The traps, Tib said. I tried to warn him. His kind never listens, the archer said. Don't feel bad about it. We don't, the archer said, eyes fixed on him. But we also lost two others. They were nice. Tib dismissed them, now that he wasn't busy trying to survive. That's going to happen, the woman said dismissively. Don't get attached. Did you make it to the last room? No, Tib said at the same time as the archer said yes. She glared at him. You're not required to reach it, said. The archer turned her glare on him. No one told us that. He smirked. You'll never be told everything you need to know. Get used to that. It's called living. If you can't make your own decisions while you're in a dungeon run, you're not going to live long. Sometimes being safe can pay off. Sure, the archer said belligerently. Care to tell us how that pays off? The woman smiled. Well, you're the first two who haven't forced themselves to make a try for the last room, and not only are you walking out without assistance, you brought back equipment, which means you are going to get to keep some coins. I'd keep that to yourself, the man said in a whisper. Others might get jealous and decide those coins should be theirs instead. I thought stealing wasn't allowed here, he said, fighting to keep standing. When has that ever stopped anyone? Asked, eyeing him. When has that ever stopped you? Not like if the thief is caught, well, we ask where he got the coins and return them. We end them and throw him in the dungeon to be eaten, so don't get any idea yourself. She motioned to the tables as the group approached. Yeah. Go hand over what you have, and remember, don't talk about what's in the dungeon with anyone. The five coming up eyed them as they crossed paths. The sorcerer who seemed to be in charge snidely commented about how they'd let their team members down. At the table, the adventurer took their shirts, robe, and equipment and dropped them in a pile with other damaged equipment. Took the coins Tibbs and the archer put on the table, all 9 of them, and put that in a metal box, closing it with a key, and he pocketed. Aye, The archer exclaimed, only to close her mouth under the glare of those utterly black eyes. Tibs sensed more than saw the people walking by. His eyes were on the pocket the key was in. If he could distract the adventurers, Tibs was confident he could get it. Then it would just be a question of getting the box, and they could have coins. The adventurer leaned toward her, hand on the table, and the pocket came temptingly close. Do not ever raise your voice at me, little Miss Arrow. Is that clear? He said in a low but firm voice. We're supposed to get coins, she said, but sounded subdued. Is that so? The adventurer asked. What about you, Mr. Lightfingers? Do you think you deserve coins, or do you plan on just taking them? Tibbs realized those black eyes were on him and swallowed. The man's expression was more amused than angry, and Tibbs realized it had been a ploy to test him. If he'd been only slightly less patient, he'd have lost more than a hand. We returned a robe, a shirt, a sword, and the amulet, he said, moving his hand behind his back as the adventurer chuckled. Doesn't that mean we get 2 coins each? That's it. Returned to point at the two adventurers, but the man before him caught his hand. Don't point, it's not polite. Told Tibbs to face him, and where the hand had been on the table were 4 copper coins. How? Tibbs stared at them. Think of it as something you have to look forward if you live that long. The adventurer said, take what's yours and find a place to hide them. You don't want others to know, not until it's common for you runners to survive and get coins out of it. The archer grabbed 2 and walked away. Tibbs took his coins and looked at them. 2 whole coins. They felt real enough. Are you coming? She asked. What can I get for them? Tibbs asked the adventurer in little more than a whisper. Not much right now, the man answered. The Avenger's cell costs more than a handful of copper. But soon enough, there'll be an inn, tavern, sleeping house. In those, a copper will get you a decent meal, a tankard of something better to drink than whatever they're serving right now. Ben shuddered. That stuff is vile, isn't it? It's food, Tibbs replied. I don't care how it tastes. The man nodded. I vaguely remember that time. Sleeping houses will have rooms for you and your team, where you can keep your stuff and not have to worry about anyone taking it from you. He motioned toward the accumulation of tents that passed for a town, and the archer waiting for Tibbs. Head off, little rogue. Keep your hands to yourself. Learn what they have to teach you, and maybe one day, if you're really unlucky, you'll stand at my place, giving advice to some other rogue, hoping to survive what he's been thrown into. Tibbs thought about what the man said. No. When I leave here, I don't want to ever have anything to do with dungeons or places like this. The adventurer studied Tibbs, then leaned forward, pulling the sleeve on his left arm up and revealing a black band tattooed above his wrist. Then, one last piece of advice, Mr. Lightfingers. When you leave here, be very careful not to be caught breaking the rules, because by then, you'll be considered too valuable to simply kill. Covered his arm again. Now, get out of here, he said harshly. Tibbs ran to catch up with the archer. What did he want? She asked, but Tibbs shook his head. I'm Ariana, by the way. Seeing how we survive, you should know my name. Tibbs, he answered, trying to understand what the rogue had meant. If someone was too valuable to kill, what exactly did they do with them? And that concludes Chapter 5 of Bottom Rung. If you are enjoying this, please leave a like. If you want to know when the next one is going to be subscribe and hit the bell. If you want to read the story, it's available for free on Royal Road. Want to support me, you can get early access to the story on my Patreon. And if you want to listen to me record these live, it's every Tuesday morning, 8 a.m. Eastern Time on Twitch. Links are in the notes, and with that, I shall wish you a good day.